From the moment you're old enough to understand the world, society hands you a story. And the story goes like this. A man who is alone is a man who failed. Maybe he couldn't hold a relationship together. Maybe he wasn't interesting enough. Maybe he didn't work hard enough, look good enough, earn enough. Maybe there is simply something broken inside him that other people can see, even if he can't. That is the narrative. And it runs deep. It runs through the way your family looks at you during holidays. It runs through the questions strangers ask at social events. It runs through the movies you watched growing up, the songs that played on the radio, the cultural mythology that surrounds the idea of a man who stands alone. A man alone is incomplete. A man alone is dangerous. A man alone is either bitter, broken, or running from something. But here's what nobody tells you. Here's the part that gets left out of every conversation, every piece of advice, every cultural message you've absorbed since childhood. The man who cannot stand alone is the man who can be controlled, and the man who learns to stand alone truly, completely, without apology, without panic, without a constant need for someone else to tell him who he is, that man becomes something rare, something that most people encounter once in their lives if they're lucky and never fully understand. This is not a story about rejecting relationships. This is not an argument against love or connection or human closeness. This is about something far more fundamental. This is about the psychological strength that lives in solitude, and why most men are never taught to develop it. Pay attention, because what comes next will challenge almost everything you've been told. Let's start with the principle that drives everything else. Dependency creates control. Read that again, because it is the foundation of everything we're going to discuss. When a person depends on external validation to feel okay, their behavior becomes predictable. And predictable behavior is manageable behavior. It can be steered. It can be leveraged. It can be used. Think about how this operates in everyday life. A man who needs approval from his social group will modify his opinions to keep that approval. He won't say what he actually thinks. He will adjust his position, soften his edges, make himself more palatable, more acceptable, more agreeable, because the cost of losing that approval feels too high. A man who needs constant emotional reassurance from a partner will tolerate things he should not tolerate. He will negotiate his self-respect in exchange for the feeling of being chosen. He will stay in situations that diminish him, because the alternative, being alone, feels worse than the damage being done. A man who needs the world to confirm his worth will spend his life chasing signals. More followers, more compliments, more recognition, more proof that he exists and matters. And while he is chasing those signals, someone else is holding the mechanism that produces them. That is the trap. And most men walk into it without ever realizing the door has closed behind them. Now here is the opposite. A man who is psychologically independent operates from an entirely different position. He doesn't need the approval, so the approval cannot be used against him. He doesn't need the validation, so the threat of removing it carries no weight. He doesn't need the relationship to confirm his identity, so the fear of losing it doesn't make him negotiable. That level of independence is not arrogance. It is not coldness. It is not emotional unavailability. It is simply the refusal to outsource your own worth. And once a man achieves that, the entire landscape of his life changes. Now here's something most people never consider. The capacity for male independence is not modern. It is not a philosophical position invented in some self-help book from the last decade. It is ancient. It is wired into the evolutionary architecture of what men were required to be. For most of human history, men operated alone for extended periods of time, not by choice, not as a preference, but as a survival requirement. Hunters left the group for days at a time with no guarantee of success and no ability to call for emotional support. Explorers crossed territories where no one knew their name. Warriors separated from their families, their communities, their entire social fabric, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. And those men had to function. They had to perform under pressure, make decisions with incomplete information, regulate their own emotional states without anyone available to help them do it. A man who collapsed without constant companionship would not survive those environments. He would make desperate decisions. He would take unnecessary risks driven by loneliness rather than strategy. He would become a liability rather than an asset. So what developed over generations was a particular psychological capacity, the ability to function alone without losing your mind, the ability to regulate yourself, to sit with discomfort, to operate in the absence of social reinforcement and still maintain direction. Modern life looks nothing like that ancestral environment. but the psychological architecture remains. The wiring is still there. And what happens in most modern men is that this capacity goes completely undeveloped, because the culture doesn't encourage it, because the discomfort of solitude is treated as something to escape rather than something to train through. Because the message sent from every direction is that aloneness is the problem and connection is always the solution. But the men who develop this capacity, the men who learn to sit with solitude and build inside of it, those men carry a quality that becomes increasingly rare. And rare things, in human dynamics, carry significant weight. Now let's talk about why independence makes certain systems uncomfortable. This is something people rarely say directly, but the pattern is clear once you start looking for it. A man who cannot be controlled through emotional dependency is a man who is difficult to predict, and unpredictable men are inconvenient for systems built around predictability. Modern culture is, in many ways, a system built around dependency. Consumer culture depends on men who need external validation because those men will spend money to feel better about themselves. Status culture depends on men who need approval because those men will chase signals of recognition indefinitely. Relationship culture, in its most dysfunctional forms, depends on men who fear aloneness because those men will accept conditions they would otherwise refuse. When a man steps outside that framework, something subtle but significant shifts. He becomes less reactive to advertising that promises to fill an emotional gap. He becomes less influenced by social pressure that uses exclusion as a threat. He becomes less susceptible to manipulation that relies on the fear of being unwanted. And because those mechanisms no longer function on him, he is sometimes perceived as a problem. He gets labeled cold, emotionally unavailable, commitment phobic, difficult. But none of those labels are accurate. The accurate description is simply this. He stopped being controllable through the usual channels, and that, to people in systems that rely on those channels, feels like a threat. Don't mistake the label for the reality. A man who doesn't need approval is not broken, he is free. So what does this look like in practice? Let's get concrete, because concepts without application are just ideas. The first place independence shows up is in how a man spends time alone. Solitude is uncomfortable. This is not an opinion. It is a measurable psychological reality. When the social noise stops, when the distractions disappear, when you are left with only your own thoughts, things surface that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Fears become louder. Insecurities become harder to rationalize away. Questions about identity and purpose start pressing against the surface, demanding answers that you cannot outsource to another person. Most men, when they encounter that discomfort, run. They fill the space. More screens, more socializing, more activity, more noise. Anything to avoid sitting with themselves long enough to actually hear what's underneath. But the men who don't run, the men who learn to stay present inside the discomfort rather than escaping it, those men develop something that cannot be bought or borrowed. They develop self-awareness. Not the performative self-awareness that sounds good in conversation, but the kind that actually changes behavior. The kind that lets you see your patterns before they run you. The kind that lets you catch your own reactive tendencies and choose differently. Solitude is not the absence of experience. It is a specific kind of experience. And like every form of training, it produces results that are invisible to people who have never done it. Moving forward from there, let's talk about what emotional self-sufficiency actually does to the power dynamics in your relationships. Because this is where things get practical in ways that most people don't fully understand. Every interaction between people involves, at some level, a negotiation. Not always explicit, not always conscious. But there is always a dynamic operating underneath the surface about who needs what from whom and how much. And the person who needs something more almost always loses leverage. This is not cynical. It is simply accurate. When you are emotionally dependent on someone's approval, your behavior around them shifts. You become more careful, more accommodating, more likely to swallow things that bother you in exchange for maintaining the relationship. And the other person, even if they never consciously exploit it, senses the dynamic. They know on some level that you need this more than they do. And that changes how they behave toward you. Now flip it. A man who is emotionally self-sufficient enters interactions differently. He is genuinely glad when things go well. He genuinely enjoys connection and closeness, but he does not need those things to remain intact as a person. That changes everything. When someone tries to use withdrawal of approval as leverage against him, it doesn't land. When someone tests his standards by pushing against them, they find the standards don't move. When someone expects him to panic at the possibility of distance, the panic never comes. And that counterintuitively creates a fundamentally different kind of respect, because people trust at a deep level the individuals who don't desperately need their validation, and they are often drawn toward people who operate from that position of internal stability. This is not a manipulation tactic. It is not a game. It is simply what genuine psychological independence looks like when it meets the reality of human relationships. Here's another dimension that deserves serious attention: freedom of decision. This one is strategic, and its impact compounds dramatically over time. When a man is operating alone, he retains a quality that becomes increasingly difficult to preserve as obligations accumulate. He retains the ability to make decisions based entirely on long-term vision rather than short-term emotional management. He can take the job offer in a different city. He can invest aggressively in a career that requires sacrifice now for returns later. He can restructure his entire daily routine around peak performance without negotiating each element. He can take risks that would be irresponsible to take when other people's emotional security is bound up in his stability. This is not an argument that relationships reduce freedom, though they do require compromise. It is an observation about what becomes possible when a man has complete control over his decisions for a defined period of time. Think about what that freedom produces if used intentionally. A man who spends 2 years alone and uses that time to build a business, strengthen his health, develop his skills, clarify his values, and build financial independence, that man does not emerge from that period diminished. He emerges from it transformed, because every decision he made during that time was made from vision rather than fear. Every resource he invested went exactly where he chose to invest it. Every habit he built was designed around his goals rather than negotiated around someone else's comfort. That is the compounding advantage of strategic solitude. And most men never access it because they spend those years trying to fill a silence they were never taught to hear as an opportunity. Let's go deeper into a specific quality that independence develops: validation independence, and why it functions as psychological armor. Think about the invisible approval systems that most people live inside without ever examining them. Social media is the most obvious one. The number on a post becomes a measurement of a worth. The comments become data about whether you are interesting, attractive, valuable. The silence becomes rejection. And all of this happens automatically, constantly, without anyone making a conscious decision to participate in the measurement. But it goes further than that. Workplace approval systems. Am I respected by the people I work with? Do my colleagues take me seriously? Does my performance generate recognition, or am I being overlooked? Social circle approval systems. Am I funny enough, interesting enough, successful enough to hold my position inside this group? Am I the kind of person that people invite and include and talk about positively when I'm not in the room? Romantic approval systems. Am I attractive enough? Am I desired? Does the way I am being treated confirm that I have value in that dimension? Every one of those systems runs in the background of most men's inner lives, consuming processing power, shaping decisions, generating anxiety, and creating extraordinary vulnerability. Because when those approval signals go negative, when the number drops, when the promotion doesn't come, when the relationship ends, for a man whose sense of worth is tied to those signals, the impact is not minor. It can be destabilizing in ways that affect everything else. Now consider what happens when a man genuinely disconnects his identity from those systems, not by becoming indifferent to results, not by pretending he doesn't care about anything, but by building his sense of worth on a foundation that external signals cannot reach. Criticism loses its power to define him, not because he ignores feedback, but because his sense of who he is does not rise and fall based on whether someone approves of him in a given moment. Rejection loses its threat. Not because rejection stops mattering, but because it no longer carries the implication that he is fundamentally inadequate. Social pressure loses its leverage, not because he doesn't care about people, but because he doesn't need their validation to make a decision. That is what validation independence actually looks like. And the man who builds it operates with a clarity and a steadiness that most people find genuinely striking, often without being able to name exactly what they're responding to. There's a behavioral dimension to all of this that we need to address directly, because psychological strength is not a concept you hold in your mind. It is a practice that shows up in choices. It shows up in how you spend the first hour of your day. Is it organized around your priorities or around reactive responses to external inputs? It shows up in the standards you enforce in your personal and professional relationships, not the standards you talk about, but the ones that are visible in your actual behavior. The things you actually allow and the things you actually don't. It shows up in what you refuse to tolerate, even when tolerating would be easier in the short term. A man who has genuine psychological independence doesn't need to announce his standards. He doesn't need to explain his decisions to people who haven't earned the right to challenge them. And he doesn't need external confirmation that his choices are valid before he makes them. His standards are visible in behavior, not in rhetoric. And that consistency, that gap between what he says and what he does being essentially zero, that is one of the most powerful signals of psychological strength that exists. Most men talk about their standards. Genuinely strong men simply live by them. And the difference is immediately recognizable to everyone around them. Now let's talk about the environment a man builds when he operates independently. This is practical and important. When your time is entirely your own, you face a choice that most people never have to make with full clarity. You can fill it with distraction and comfort, or you can build it into something. A man who operates alone controls his environment completely. His schedule is not negotiated. His habits are not compromised for someone else's preferences. His daily structure is designed entirely around the person he is trying to become, and the goals he has decided matter. That level of control, when used intentionally, becomes an enormous compounding advantage. Think about what it means to control your sleep schedule completely, to control your nutrition without compromise, to control the hours when you do your most demanding cognitive work, to control the information you consume, the people you spend time with, the environment you spend your time in. Each of those elements individually has a modest effect. But when a man optimizes all of them simultaneously over an extended period, the result is not modest. The result is the development of a man who operates at a level that most men never reach, not because they lack the capacity, but because their environment was never designed around their growth. Solitude, used intentionally, is not emptiness. It is a construction project, and the thing being built is the most important thing any man will ever build, himself. One of the most recognizable traits of psychologically developed men is something that is easy to observe but difficult to fully articulate. It's a quality of presence that communicates stability without announcing it. These men are not easily shaken, not by conflict, not by criticism, not by the social pressures that make other men reactive and desperate and loud. They don't need to dominate conversations to prove something. They don't need to perform confidence in a way that reveals the insecurity underneath. They don't need the room to recognize them before they feel comfortable in it. They simply arrive. And the stability travels with them. This is what quiet authority actually looks like. And it has nothing to do with status or wealth or physical size or any of the external markers that people typically associate with power. It is entirely internal. It is entirely the product of a man who has spent time building his relationship with himself rather than constantly turning outward in search of confirmation. The interesting thing is that this quality attracts respect in ways that the performance of power never quite achieves, because people can tell the difference, even if they can't articulate it, between a man who needs to be seen as powerful and a man who simply is what he is, completely without apology, without seeking your recognition for it. The first one demands a response from you. The second one generates one without trying. As we expand this picture into broader dynamics, something important emerges: independence. Genuine psychological independence tends to shift the dynamic of every environment of arena a man enters, not because he demands it, not because he is performing something designed to produce that effect, but because the presence of a person operating from internal stability creates contrast. Most social environments run on subtle undercurrents of insecurity, approval-seeking, status negotiation, and reactive behavior. When those dynamics make up the water everyone is swimming in, they become invisible. They feel normal. And then a man enters who doesn't operate on those currents. He doesn't reach for approval. He doesn't react to status games. He doesn't adjust his positions to match the temperature of the room. He simply occupies his own position steadily, without friction, without aggression, without any particular effort. And that steadiness functions as a kind of mirror. People around it start to become aware, sometimes uncomfortably, of how much of their own behavior is driven by the need for validation that this man clearly doesn't share. Some people find that inspiring. They want to understand it, to get closer to it, to learn from it. Some people find it threatening, and it exposes something they would rather not examine. Both responses are understandable, and both of them confirm the same thing. The man who operates from genuine independence changes the dynamic of the room not by demanding to, but simply by being something different from what the room is used to. That is influence without effort, and is one of the most significant forms of power available to any man. Now we need to make an important distinction, because there is a version of what we've been describing that is genuinely admirable, and there is a version that is simply dysfunction with better packaging. Solitude is not loneliness. This matters enormously, and the difference is not always obvious from the outside. Loneliness is the experience of absence. It is the feeling of something missing, a gap where a connection should be, a hunger that is not being fed. A lonely man is not choosing his solitude. He is suffering it. He is in a constant low-grade state of deprivation, reaching toward connection that isn't arriving, feeling the isolation of his situation as a wound. Solitude is something completely different. Solitude is presence. Not the presence of other people, but the presence of yourself. It is a man inhabiting his own inner world fully, without panic, without the need for constant external input to feel okay about who he is. A man practicing genuine solitude is not hiding from connection. He is not afraid of intimacy. He is not building walls disguised as independence. He is simply comfortable in his own company in a way that allows him to be genuinely present with others when he chooses to be, rather than desperately needing them in a way that corrodes those relationships from the inside. The psychologically strong man we have been describing throughout this conversation is not someone who has decided to be alone forever. He is not running from relationships. He is someone who has built an inner life rich enough that he is not defined by the relationships he is in, or not in. He can love deeply without losing himself. He can commit fully without losing his direction. He can be present with another person without converting that person into a support system for his sense of worth. That is what genuine wholeness looks like in a man. And it begins, always, with learning to be alone without it breaking you. Here's something worth sitting with. The path we have been describing is not the path of the least resistance. Everything in the modern environment is designed to pull a man away from it. The constant noise of social media, the dopamine cycles of approval and rejection, the cultural narrative that aloneness equals failure, the endless stream of distraction available at any moment through any device. All of it is pulling in the opposite direction. And most men follow that pull without ever questioning whether it's taking them somewhere they actually want to go. The man who chooses a different path accepts a particular kind of difficulty. He accepts the discomfort of being with himself when being with himself is uncomfortable. He accepts the social awkwardness of being the person who doesn't need the thing that everyone around him is chasing. He accepts the internal work of building something solid in himself rather than borrowing solidity from external sources that can always be withdrawn. That is not easy, but here's what the difficulty produces. It produces a man who cannot be destabilized by the loss of external validation because he doesn't depend on it. It produces a man who cannot be controlled through the fear of aloneness because he is not afraid of it. It produces a man whose confidence is not borrowed from circumstances and therefore cannot be taken by the change of circumstances. That man is carrying something that most men never build, not because they lacked the capacity, but because they never realized it needed to be built, because the culture never told them that the work of becoming psychologically independent was among the most important work any man could do. You are hearing it now. Let's bring this together with complete clarity. The world will spend your entire life trying to convince you that your worth lives somewhere outside yourself, in the relationship that chose you, in the approval of the people around you, in the social positions you've managed to secure, in the external markers of success that other people can see and verify. And as long as you believe that, you can be managed through any one of those things. Threaten the relationship and you become compliant. Withdraw the approval and you become accommodating. Challenge the status and you become reactive. You become, in the most fundamental sense, manageable. But a man who has done the work of building his identity from the inside out is not manageable in the same way. His worth is not on the table. It is not negotiable. It does not go up when he is chosen or down when he is rejected. It does not expand when he is praised or collapse when he is criticized. It is simply his, built through the quiet accumulation of self-knowledge, self-discipline, and genuine comfort with his own company. That man has something that no external circumstance can easily destroy. And that is precisely what psychological strength in a single man looks like at its deepest level. Not aggression, not isolation, not emotional unavailability, simply a man who stands inside himself completely, who does not need the world to confirm what he already knows, who has sat alone with his own thoughts long enough to understand what he is made of, and who moves through the world from that understanding rather than constantly seeking permission to exist. The men who develop this are rare. They have always been rare, because it requires something that most people are not willing to do. It requires sitting with yourself in silence without running until the silence stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like home. Once a man reaches that place, something shifts permanently. He doesn't become cold. He doesn't become distant. He doesn't become the man who needs nothing from anyone. He becomes the man who can give fully, love genuinely, and connect deeply, precisely because none of those things are being used to fill a hole in him. And that is the version of strength most men are never taught to seek. But once you understand it, once you see what it actually is and what it actually produces, there is no going back to the version of yourself that needed the world's permission to feel whole. The path is available. It always has been. The only question is whether you're willing to walk it.